This photo with three friends looks peaceful, but experts have found a dark secret. Dr. Rebecca Foster had looked at thousands of photographs during her 15 years as a forensic image analyst at the National Archives. But something about this particular picture made her stop. It had come as part of a donated collection from an estate in Georgia, boxes of old photographs, letters, and documents that the family had kept in an attic for over a century. The photograph showed three young black women, likely in their early 20s, posed in a photographer's studio. The date written in pencil on the back said, April 1903, Atlanta. The arrangement was formal but close. Three friends sat in a triangular shape, two seated a little forward, one standing behind. They wore their best dresses, simple but carefully pressed cotton clothes with high collars and long sleeves. Their hair was styled neatly, their faces calm and proud. At first look, it seemed like many other portraits from that time. A moment of pride caught on film. Three friends marking their bond. But Rebecca's trained eye noticed details that did not quite fit. She put the photograph under her high-resolution scanner, a machine that could capture details invisible to the naked eye. As the image processed, she studied the original print more carefully. The lighting was a bit unusual, brighter on one person than the others. The posture of the woman in the center seemed almost too perfect, too stiff. When the digital scan appeared on her screen, Rebecca zoomed in on the faces. The two women on the sides had natural expressions, slight tension around the eyes, the barely noticeable blur of tiny movements during the long exposure time needed for 1903 photography. But the woman in the center was different. Her face showed none of that subtle motion blur. Her eyes, though open, had a glassy look. Her skin tone seemed a little different from her companions. Rebecca's heart started to race. She had seen this before in her research on Victorian-era photography practices. She zoomed in further, checking the woman's hands, her posture, the way the other two women's arms were placed, not just beside her, but holding her up. She picked up her phone and called her colleague, Dr. Marcus Chen, a historian specializing in African-American photography and post-Civil War records. Marcus, I need you to look at something. I think I found a post-mortem photograph, but it is not marked as such. And there is something else. Something that suggests this was not a natural death. Marcus's voice came through right away. Alert. Send it now. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Rebecca hit send and went back to the image, her mind already moving through the meaning. Post-mortem photography was common in the early 1900s, a way for families to have one last picture of a loved one. But this photograph had been posed to look like the person was alive. The two other women had gone to great lengths to create that look. The question was why. Marcus arrived with his laptop bag and a pile of reference books on early 20th century photography. He was a man in his late 40s with graying hair and sharp analytical eyes that had spent decades studying historical images for hidden truths. Rebecca pulled up the high-resolution scan on her large monitor. Marcus leaned forward, his face changing from curiosity to focused intensity within seconds. Show me the details you noticed, he said quietly. Rebecca zoomed in on the central woman's face. Look at the eyes first. They are open, but there is no catchlight, no reflection of the studio lights that would naturally appear in a living person's eyes. The pupils are fixed and wide. And here she moved to the woman's hands, folded carefully in her lap. No tension in the fingers. In living subjects, even when trying to stay still, there is always some muscle tension visible. These hands are completely relaxed. Too relaxed. Marcus pulled out one of his books, flipping to a section on post-mortem photography methods. In the early 1900s, photographers developed ways to make deceased subjects appear alive. They would prop the body in a standing or sitting position using hidden supports, positioned the arms carefully, sometimes even used wire to hold the eyes open, or painted pupils onto closed eyelids. He studied the image more carefully. But this is unusual. Most post-mortem photographs from this era, especially in black communities, were clearly marked as memorial portraits. Families wanted to acknowledge their loss, to honor the deceased. This photograph is deliberately designed to deceive, to make it appear all three women are alive. Rebecca nodded. That is what concerns me. Why would they do that? Marcus zoomed in on the two living women's faces. Look at their expressions. This is not grief. It is determination, resolve. And look here. He pointed to their hands, which were carefully placed to support their friend's Miles' body, while appearing to simply rest beside her. This required planning, coordination with the photographer, and considerable courage. Courage? Rebecca asked. Creating a false record was risky, especially for black women in 1903 Georgia. If authorities discovered they documented a death without reporting it, or if they were hiding information about how she died, Marcus trailed off, the meaning clear. He pulled up his database of historical records from Atlanta in the early 1900s. This was a dangerous time. Racial violence was widespread. Black people who died under suspicious circumstances were often written off as accidents or suicides, even when evidence suggested otherwise. If these women went to this extraordinary effort to create this photograph, there must have been a strong reason. Rebecca enhanced another section of the image. There is something else. Look at the deceased woman's neck, just above the collar of her dress. Marcus leaned closer. Even with the high-resolution scan, the detail was subtle, a faint discoloration barely visible that could easily be dismissed as a shadow or mark from the photographic process. That could be bruising, Marcus said slowly, hidden by the high collar and careful positioning, but visible if you know what to look for. Exactly, Rebecca confirmed. And this was not a natural death. And her friends knew it. They created this photograph as evidence. Evidence that she existed, evidence of what happened to her, disguised as an innocent portrait of three friends. Marcus sat back processing the meaning. We need to find out who these women were and what happened. Because this photograph is not just a memorial, it is testimony. Marcus spent the next morning at the Georgia State Archives in Atlanta, searching through death records, newspaper reports, and city documents from 1903. Rebecca joined him after lunch, bringing enhanced prints of the photograph that highlighted specific details: the bruising on the neck, the careful positioning, the studio background that might help identify the photographer. The archives were housed in a modern building, but the records they sought were fragile, stored in climate-controlled rooms and handled with white cotton gloves. The clerk, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harrison, who had worked there for 30 years, listened to their request with growing interest. African-American death records from 1903 are incomplete, she warned. Many deaths went unreported, or were recorded only in black church records and newspapers. The official city records often ignored black residents entirely, unless there was some legal reason to document them. She brought out several ledgers containing death certificates from Atlanta in 1903. Marcus and Rebecca worked through them carefully, looking for young black women who died in April of that year. The records were sparse and often dismissive. Causes of death listed simply as heart failure, accident, or unknown causes. After 2 hours, Marcus found an entry that made him stop. Rebecca, look at this. The death certificate was dated April 15, 1903. Name, colored female, approximately 22 years old, identified as Clara. No last name recorded. Cause of death, accidental fall. Location, near Decatur Street. The certificate was signed by a city coroner, but contained no additional details. No investigation notes, no witness statements. Nothing to explain how a healthy young woman had supposedly died from a fall. Just Clara, Rebecca said quietly. No last name, no family listed, no real investigation. Mrs. Harrison had been watching over their shoulders. That was common. Black deaths were often recorded with minimal information, especially if the authorities did not want to investigate further. Accidental fall was a frequent designation for deaths that were anything but accidental. Marcus photographed the certificate carefully. The date matches, April 1903, and the age is right. But we need more. We need to find out who Clara was, who her friends were, and what really happened to her. Mrs. Harrison thought for a moment. Have you checked the black newspapers from that time? The Atlanta Independent was operating in 1903. They covered stories the white papers ignored, including suspicious deaths in the black community. She led them to another section of the archives where old newspapers were stored on microfilm. Marcus loaded the April 1903 editions of the Atlanta Independent onto the reader and began scrolling through the pages. Most of the content focused on community news, church events, business openings, social gatherings, but in the April 18th edition, 3 days after Clara's official death date, he found a small article buried on page 3. Community mourns loss of young woman. Read the headline. The article was brief. Friends and family gathered to mourn Clara Johnson, aged 22, who died under tragic circumstances on April 15th. Miss Johnson was known for her work as a seamstress and her involvement in community uplift efforts. She is survived by 2 close friends, Eunice Parker and Dorothy Williams, who request privacy during this difficult time. There, Rebecca said, pointing at the screen, Eunice Parker and Dorothy Williams. Those must be the 2 living women in the photograph. Marcus continued reading. It says she was a seamstress involved in community uplift efforts. That is often code language. It could mean she was involved in civil rights organizing, education efforts, or helping people deal with the oppressive laws of the time. He scrolled forward through later editions, looking for any follow-up. In the April 25th edition, he found another brief mention. Questions remain regarding the circumstances of Miss Clara Johnson's death. Community members have expressed concern that the official investigation was inadequate. The coroner's ruling of accidental death has been disputed by witnesses who claim to have seen Miss Johnson with visible injuries prior to her fall. Rebecca felt a chill. Witnesses saw injuries before she died. This was not an accident. It was murder, and the authorities covered it up. With the names Eunice Parker and Dorothy Williams, Marcus began searching for any other records that might connect to these women or reveal more about their relationship with Clara Johnson. Meanwhile, Rebecca focused on identifying the photography studio where the portrait had been taken. She examined the photograph's background carefully, the painted backdrop, the style of the chair, the lighting setup. Early 1900s photography studios each had distinctive characteristics, and Atlanta had a small number of photographers who served the black community. After consulting with a colleague who specialized in photographic history, Rebecca identified the studio as belonging to Thomas Bailey, one of Atlanta's few black photographers operating in 1903. His studio had been located on Auburn Avenue in the heart of Atlanta's black business district. Marcus found a reference to Bailey in a 1904 city directory. The listing included an advertisement: Thomas Bailey, photographer, portraits, family groups, memorial photography, discretion assured. That last phrase caught Marcus's attention. It suggested Bailey was willing to work with clients who needed sensitivity or privacy. They discovered that Bailey's studio had closed in 1920, but his grandson, Ernest Bailey, still lived in Atlanta. Marcus called him that evening. Ernest was a retired postal worker in his 80s, surprised but interested by the inquiry. My grandfather's photographs. I have some of his old records. Yes. He kept careful documentation. He believed his work was important historical record. They arranged to meet the next morning at Ernest's home in the West End neighborhood. The house was modest but well kept, filled with family photographs spanning generations. Ernest led them to a back room where he stored his grandfather's materials, boxes of glass plate negatives, ledger books, and letters. My grandfather photographed many people in the community. Ernest explained he saw his work as more than just taking pictures. He was documenting our existence, our dignity, our lives, at a time when the wider world wanted to pretend we did not matter. Marcus carefully opened one of the ledger books, looking for entries from April 1903. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, names, dates, types of portraits, payments received. On April 17, 1903, 2 days after Clara Johnson's death, there was an entry that made his pulse quicken. Portrait, 3 subjects: Eunice Parker, Dorothy Williams. Memorial for Clara Johnson. Special circumstances. Subjects request privacy paid in full. Memorial for Clara Johnson. Rebecca read over his shoulder. So it was officially recorded as a memorial portrait, but the photograph itself was posed to look like she was alive. Ernest looked at the entry. Then at the photograph Rebecca showed him. His expression grew serious. My grandfather told stories about photographs like this. Sometimes families would come to him after a suspicious death, a lynching, a beating, a murder that the authorities refused to investigate. They wanted documentation, evidence, but they could not risk being obvious about it. So they would create portraits that looked innocent, but contained hidden truth. Did your grandfather ever face consequences for this? Marcus asked. He was careful, very careful, but yes, There were times when white authorities questioned him, threatened him. He walked a dangerous line, using his art to preserve truth while appearing to simply be a community photographer. Ernest paused, emotion in his voice. He believed that someday, when it was safe, these photographs would tell the real story. That is why he kept such detailed records. He pulled out another document, a letter dated 1903, written in a woman's hand. This was tucked in with that ledger entry. My grandfather kept it all these years. The letter was addressed to Thomas Bailey and signed by Dorothy Williams. Marcus handled the letter carefully, its paper brittle with age. Rebecca stood beside him as he read aloud. Mr. Bailey, we come to you because we know you are a man of honor and discretion. Our dear friend Clara Johnson was taken from us through violence. Though the authorities have called it an accident, we know the truth, but we cannot speak it openly without risking our own lives. We ask that you help us create a portrait that honors Clara and preserves the truth of what happened to her. Let the world believe it is simply three friends, but let the photograph itself bear witness. We trust you to keep our secret until the day it is safe to reveal. With gratitude, Dorothy Williams. The room fell silent. Ernest's eyes were damp. My grandfather kept this letter for 70 years before he died. He never told anyone about it. Too dangerous. He passed it to my father, who passed it to me with instructions to protect it until the time was ma. Rebecca felt the weight of that responsibility. Ernest, do you know what happened to Dorothy Williams and Eunice Parker? Did they face consequences for creating this photograph? Ernest shook his head. I do not know their full stories, but I know that many black women who spoke up about violence, who tried to seek justice, faced retaliation. Some lost their jobs. Some were driven out of their communities. Some simply disappeared. Marcus was already pulling out his laptop. We need to find out what happened to them, and we need to find out the full truth about how Clara Johnson died. Over the next week, Marcus and Rebecca conducted intensive research. City directories showed that Dorothy Williams had worked as a teacher at a school for black children. Eunice Parker had been employed at a laundry. Both women lived in the Auburn Avenue area in a boarding house for single black women. In church records, they found evidence that all three women had been members of the Friendship Baptist Church and had participated in a women's mutual aid society, an organization where black women pooled resources to help each other during emergencies, illness, or financial hardship. But it was a discovery in the Atlanta Independent from July 1903 that provided the breakthrough. A small article reported, Miss Dorothy Williams, formerly a teacher at the Auburn Avenue School, has relocated to Philadelphia. Friends say she departed for new opportunities, though she will be greatly missed in our community. Another article from September 1903 noted, Miss Eunice Parker has left Atlanta to join family in Chicago. The community extends best wishes for her future. They both left within months of Clara's death. Rebecca observed, that is not coincidence. But Marcus found one more piece of the puzzle in the records of the Auburn Avenue School. A notation in the administrative log from May 1903 stated, Dorothy Williams dismissed from teaching position. Reason conduct unbecoming. No further details provided. Conduct unbecoming was often code for political activity, or speaking out against injustice. Marcus explained if Dorothy had been asking questions about Clara's death, pushing for a real investigation, the white school board would have seen that as justification to fire her. Rebecca looked at the photograph again, seeing it with fresh understanding. So Clara Johnson was murdered. Dorothy and Eunice knew the truth, but could not speak it openly. They created this photograph as evidence, a record that Clara existed, a record of what happened to her, hidden in plain sight. Then they were forced to flee Atlanta to escape retaliation, and they took the secret with them, Marcus added, along with this photograph which someone preserved for 120 years, until modern technology could reveal what they encoded in it. The question remained, what exactly had happened to Clara Johnson? Who had killed her, and why? And Marcus reached out to historians specializing in early 20th century Atlanta, particularly those who had researched racial violence and the black community's responses to it. One researcher, Dr. Vivian Grant from Emory University, responded with information that began to piece together Clara Johnson's final days. Dr. Grant had been compiling oral histories and archival records about Atlanta's black community during the period between the 1906 race riot and World War I. In her research, she had encountered references to Clara Johnson in unexpected places. Clara Johnson was not just a seamstress, Dr. Grant explained during a video call. She was part of a network of black women who were secretly documenting cases of racial violence and injustice. They called themselves the Witnesses. They would record incidents, gather testimony, and send reports to northern newspapers and civil rights organizations. She shared documents from her research, letters sent to the NAACP's precursor organizations, articles published in northern black newspapers, testimony collected about incidents in Atlanta. Clara Johnson's name appeared in several of these documents, always as someone who had provided information or assisted in documentation. This was incredibly dangerous work. Dr. Grant continued. White authorities in Atlanta were paranoid about black people organizing or communicating with northern activists. Anyone suspected of this kind of activity could face violence, imprisonment, or death. Marcus felt pieces clicking into place. So Clara was targeted because of her activism. That is my belief, Dr. Grant confirmed, and I have evidence to support it. Look at this. She sent them a digital scan of a letter dated April 10, 1903, 5 days before Clara's death. The letter was written by a white city official to the Atlanta police chief. It read, "We have received reports that certain Negro women are collecting information about incidents involving colored persons and white citizens. This activity constitutes incitement and must be stopped. I am informed that a seamstress named Clara Johnson is among the agitators. Appropriate action should be taken." Rebecca felt sick. They targeted her. This was premeditated. The official record says she died from an accidental fall. Dr. Grant said, but I found testimony from a woman who lived on Decatur Street collected by a northern journalist in 1904. She stated that on the night of April 15, 1903, she heard screams and saw 2 white men dragging a black woman down the street. The next morning, Clara Johnson's body was found at the base of an exterior staircase behind a building. The police ruled it an accidental fall and closed the case within hours. Marcus clenched his fists. They murdered her and called it an accident, and Dorothy and Eunice knew the truth, but could not say anything without becoming targets themselves. Dr. Grant nodded, which is why they created that photograph. It was an act of tremendous courage, a way to preserve Clara's image, to document that she existed and that her death mattered while appearing to simply be mourning friends. The photograph itself became evidence, waiting for a time when someone could safely reveal its secret. Rebecca examined the photograph again with this new context. The determined expressions on Dorothy and Eunice's faces now made perfect sense. They were not just grieving, they were bearing witness, creating a record that would outlast the violence and oppression of their time. "Do we know anything else about Clara?" Rebecca asked. "About who she was beyond her activism?" Dr. Grant smiled sadly. "Some church records indicate she was orphaned young and raised by an aunt. She learned sewing and established herself as a skilled seamstress, but her real passion was education and justice. Friends described her as fearless, someone who believed that documenting truth was sacred work, even when it was dangerous." She paused, then added, "And there is one more thing. I found a letter written by Dorothy Williams in 1945, 42 years after Clara's death. By then, Dorothy was living in Philadelphia, elderly, and near the end of her life. She wrote to a civil rights organization, finally telling Clara's full story. She ended the letter with these words, "We made a photograph together, the 3 of us, Clara, Eunice, and me. To anyone who looks at it, we are just 3 friends. But we know the truth, and someday, when it is safe, the world will know it too. Clara died fighting for justice. We made sure she would be remembered." Marcus looked at Rebecca. She knew, Dorothy knew that someday someone would look closely enough to see the truth hidden in that photograph. With Clara Johnson's full story beginning to emerge, Marcus and Rebecca faced a crucial question. Were there descendants who should know this history? The search proved challenging. Clara had died young and unmarried, and her aunt had died within a few years of Clara's death, leaving no obvious family line to trace. But Dorothy Williams and Eunice Parker had both lived long lives after leaving Atlanta. If they had families, those descendants deserved to know the truth about the photograph and the woman their ancestors had honored with such courage. Marcus started with Dorothy Williams, who had relocated to Philadelphia in 1903. City directories showed her living at various addresses, working first as a domestic worker, then eventually returning to teaching in the 1920s, when Philadelphia's black schools were more welcoming of educators who challenged injustice. He found her death certificate from 1947. She had lived to age 66, dying of heart failure. The document listed one surviving child, Helen Williams Jackson, daughter residing in Philadelphia. Through genealogical databases and public records, Marcus traced Helen's lineage forward. Helen had married, had 3 children, and lived until 1989. One of her children, a woman named Sandra Jackson, was still alive and living in Philadelphia. Marcus found a phone number, and after several deep breaths to steady his nerves, made the call. Sandra Jackson answered on the 4th ring. She was a retired nurse in her 70s, and she listened with growing emotion as Marcus explained why he was calling. A photograph from 1903. 3 women, one of them her great-grandmother Dorothy Williams. "I have that photograph," Sandra said, her voice trembling. "My grandmother Helen gave it to me before she died. She said it was precious, that it held a secret, but she did not know what the secret was. Her mother, my great-grandmother Dorothy, had made her promise to keep it safe, to pass it down, and to never forget the 3rd woman in the picture." Marcus felt chills. The 3rd woman was Clara Johnson. "Your great-grandmother and her friend Eunice created that photograph to preserve the truth about Clara's murder, when they could not speak that truth openly without endangering their own lives." Sandra was crying now. "I knew my great-grandmother had been involved in civil rights work, that she had left Atlanta because it was not safe, but I never knew the details. I never knew about Clara." Over the next hour, Marcus and Rebecca told Sandra everything they had discovered. Sandra shared what she knew about Dorothy's life, how she had arrived in Philadelphia traumatized and grieving, how she had eventually found her voice again as a teacher, how she had spent her life fighting for justice while carrying the weight of Clara's memory. "She never stopped talking about courage," Sandra said. "She used to tell us that standing up for truth was the most important thing a person could do, even when it cost everything. Now I understand why." Marcus found Eunice Parker's descendants through similar detective work. Eunice had settled in Chicago, married, and had 2 children. Her great-granddaughter, Michelle Thompson, was a social worker in her 60s, living in the same Chicago neighborhood where Eunice had made her home. When Marcus contacted Michelle, she too had a copy of the photograph. "My great-grandmother kept this her whole life," Michelle said. "She told my grandmother that it was a picture of the bravest woman she ever knew, that someday the world would understand." Within 2 weeks, Marcus and Rebecca had arranged a meeting in Atlanta. Sandra Jackson from Philadelphia, Michelle Thompson from Chicago, and Ernest Bailey, the photographer's grandson, all gathering to see the photograph displayed together and to hear the full story of what their ancestors had done. The meeting took place at the Auburn Avenue Research Library on African American culture and history, a fitting location for this reunion across generations. When the 3 descendants met for the first time, embracing as if they were long-lost family, there was not a dry eye in the room. The story of Clara Johnson and the photograph broke nationally 6 months later, when Marcus and Rebecca published their research in the Journal of African American History. The article titled "Hidden Witness: A Post-Mortem Photograph as Evidence of Racial Violence in 1903 Atlanta," detailed every aspect of their investigation, from the initial discovery, to the identification of the subjects, to the revelation of Clara's murder and her friends' courageous response. Major media outlets picked up the story immediately. The photograph appeared in newspapers and on news websites across the country, with headlines that captured the public's imagination. 120-year-old photo reveals brutal murder. Friends created secret evidence in plain sight. Technology uncovers truth hidden for over a century. But Marcus and Rebecca were careful in how they presented the story. They worked with Sandra, Michelle, and Ernest to ensure that the narrative centered not on the sensational aspects of a hidden death, but on the courage and resistance of the 3 women who had created the photograph. "This is not just a story about a murder," Rebecca told reporters during a press conference at the National Archives. It is a story about Black women using the tools available to them: friendship, creativity, and determination to bear witness to injustice when speaking openly would have cost them their lives. Marcus added, Dorothy Williams and Eunice Parker could not go to the police. They could not publish the truth in newspapers. They could not march or protest, but they could create this photograph, encoding the truth in an image that appeared innocent while actually serving as testimony. That is profound resistance. The photograph itself became the centerpiece of a traveling exhibition titled Hidden: Witness, Photography, Memory, and Justice. The exhibition included the original photograph, enlarged to show every detail, alongside the documents that told Clara, Dorothy, and Eunice's stories. It featured Dorothy's letter to Thomas Bailey, the death certificate that falsely claimed accidental fall, the newspaper articles that hinted at the truth, and testimony from Sandra and Michelle about their ancestors' lives. Visitors to the exhibition could see the photograph from different distances. From far away, it appeared to be exactly what it was designed to look like: three friends posing together. But as visitors approached, audio guides explained what to look for: the lack of catchlight in Clara's eyes, the way her hands were too relaxed, the subtle bruising on her neck, the determined expressions on Dorothy and Eunice's faces. One section of the exhibition focused on the broader context: the epidemic of racial violence in early 1900s America, the ways Black communities documented and resisted that violence despite tremendous danger, and the role of Black photographers in preserving truth. Another section honored the witnesses, the network of Black women that Clara had been part of, who had documented racial violence and sent reports to Northern organizations. Historians had found evidence that this network operated in at least 6 Southern cities, and quietly gathering testimony and evidence that would later become crucial to civil rights legal cases. The exhibition opened in Atlanta at the Auburn Avenue Research Library, just blocks from where Clara Johnson had lived and died. The opening drew hundreds of people: historians, activists, community members, and descendants of other families who had experienced similar violence and erasure. Sandra Jackson spoke at the opening, her voice strong and clear. My great-grandmother Dorothy carried this secret for over 40 years. She could not speak it openly, but she made sure the truth was preserved. She knew that someday justice would require evidence. That photograph was her testimony, held in trust for a future generation. Michelle Thompson added, my great-grandmother Eunice used to say, what's done in the dark will come to light. She believed that truth could not be buried forever, and she was right. The exhibition prompted new research into Clara Johnson's life and work. Historians began searching archives across the country for documents related to the witnesses and for other cases where Clara had provided documentation of racial violence. Dr. Vivian Grant led a team that discovered correspondence in the NAACP archives, letters from 1903 and 1904 that included information provided by sources in Atlanta about incidents of police brutality, discriminatory arrests, and violence against Black residents. Cross-referencing dates and details, they determined that at least 7 of these reports had come from Clara Johnson before her death. She documented beatings by police officers, false arrests designed to feed the convict leasing system, intimidation of Black voters, and attacks by white mobs. Dr. Grant explained, during a symposium on the exhibition, her reports were detailed, included names and dates, and were written with the care of someone who understood she was creating a historical record. The team also found that after Clara's death, Dorothy Williams and Eunice Parker had continued the work. From Philadelphia and Chicago, respectively, they had maintained correspondence with civil rights organizations, providing information about conditions in Atlanta, and supporting campaigns for federal anti-lynching legislation. They did not stop bearing witness. Dr. Grant said Clara's murder could have silenced them, but instead, it strengthened their resolve. They continued her work from safer locations, honoring her memory by carrying forward her mission. The exhibition also sparked conversations about the thousands of other Black Americans whose deaths were falsely recorded as accidents, suicides, or natural causes. Deaths that were actually murders covered up by authorities who were complicit or indifferent. A database project began, led by a coalition of universities and civil rights organizations, to document cases of suspicious deaths in the Jim Crow era. Researchers examined death certificates, newspaper reports, and family testimonies, looking for patterns of erasure and cover-up. The project was named the Clara Johnson Documentation Initiative. We estimate that tens of thousands of deaths were misrecorded or never officially recorded at all, explained one of the project's directors. Every one of those deaths was a person with a name and a story, and people who loved them. The Clara Johnson Initiative is about restoring truth and dignity to those who were denied it in war death. Sandra Jackson and Michelle Thompson became involved in the initiative, traveling to speak at churches, community centers, and universities about their ancestors' courage and the importance of bearing witness to truth. My great-grandmother Dorothy believed that silence was the enemy of justice. Sandra told audiences, and she taught her children and grandchildren, that we have an obligation to speak truth, to document injustice, and to remember those who were taken from us. That is why she preserved that photograph for decades, waiting for the day when it would be safe to reveal its secret. The photograph itself had taken on new meaning. It was no longer just evidence of a historical crime. It had become a symbol of resistance, of the power of bearing witness, of the courage required to preserve truth in the face of violence and oppression. Art students studied the photograph's composition, learning how Dorothy, Eunice, and Thomas Bailey had collaborated to create an image that could hide truth in plain sight. Ethics classes discussed the moral courage required to document injustice when doing so. Openly meant death. History students examined it as an example of how marginalized communities preserve their own histories when official records fail them. And in Atlanta, community members raised funds for a memorial. It would be placed on Auburn Avenue, near where Clara Johnson had lived, worked, and died. The memorial would feature an enlarged version of the photograph with Clara's Ender's story, told in her own words. Words compiled from the reports she had written, the testimony others had given about her, character and courage, and the legacy she had left behind. The inscription would read, Clara Johnson, 1881-1903. Witness, activist, truth-teller. She documented injustice when speaking openly meant death. Her friends preserved her memory when authorities tried to erase her existence. Her courage inspires us still. The memorial was unveiled on April 15, 2024, exactly 121 years after Clara Johnson's death. Sandra Jackson and Michelle Thompson stood together before the gathered crowd, their hands clasped, flanked by their children and grandchildren. Ernest Bailey's family was there too, representing the photographer who had helped create the evidence that had preserved Clara's truth. The ceremony began with a moment of silence. Then Sandra spoke, her voice carrying across the crowd of hundreds who had gathered on Auburn Avenue. 121 years ago, my great-grandmother Dorothy Williams and her friend Eunice Parker lost someone they loved. Clara Johnson was murdered for the crime of documenting truth, for daring to say that Black lives mattered, that violence against us should be recorded and remembered and challenged. They could not speak that truth openly. They could not demand justice in courts that did not recognize their humanity. But they could do one thing. They could make sure Clara was not forgotten. Michelle continued. They walked into Thomas Bailey's photography studio 2 days after Clara's death, carrying her body, and asked him to help them create a photograph that would look like 3 living friends, but would actually serve as evidence. Evidence that Clara existed. Evidence of what happened to her. Evidence to be held in trust until the day came when it could be safely revealed. That day has come. We stand here now 121 years later, speaking Clara's name, telling her story, demanding that her life and death be remembered. Dr. Vivian Grant spoke about Clara's work with the witnesses, about how the documentation she and many Black women created became crucial evidence in later civil rights legal battles. She announced that the Clara Johnson Documentation Initiative had already identified over 300 cases of suspicious deaths in the early 1900s that warranted further investigation. Rebecca Foster and Marcus Chen presented their ongoing research, revealing that they had found evidence of at least 12 other photographs from the same era that appeared to contain hidden information about racial violence. Photographs that, like Clara's, had been carefully posed to preserve truth while appearing innocent. This tells us that Dorothy, Eunice, Clara, and Thomas were not alone. Marcus said there were others, photographers and families across the South, who were using images as secret testimony, creating records that could survive when people could not. We are now working to identify these photographs and tell their stories. The memorial itself was simple but powerful. The enlarged photograph showed all three women clearly. Clara in the center, forever preserved at age 22, flanked by the friends who had loved her enough to risk everything to honor her memory. Below the image was Clara's biography, her work with the witnesses, and the truth about how she died. But the most powerful element was a mirror placed below the memorial. Visitors looking at Clara's ends photograph would see their own reflection beneath it, with an inscription that read, "You are the witness now. What will you preserve? What truth will you tell?" As the ceremony concluded, Sandra and Michelle placed flowers at the base of the memorial. White roses for Clara, yellow roses for Dorothy, pink roses for Eunice. Then they invited others to add their own flowers, to speak the names of their own ancestors who had been taken by violence, whose deaths had been erased or falsified, whose stories deserved to be told. The line stretched down Auburn Avenue. For hours, people came forward laying flowers and speaking names. Some brought photographs of their own great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents, for ancestors whose stories had been buried but not forgotten. The memorial became a gathering place, a space for collective memory and shared grief, but also for collective strength and determination. That evening, as the sun set over Atlanta, the three descendants, Sandra, Michelle, and Ernest, stood together before the memorial. They thought about their ancestors, about the courage it had taken to create that photograph in 1903, about the faith required to believe that someday, somehow, the truth would emerge. They knew, Sandra said quietly. Dorothy and Eunice knew that technology would eventually advance, that someday, someone would look closely enough to see what they had hidden. They believed in a future where their testimony could finally be heard. Michelle nodded, and they were right. Their courage, their creativity, their refusal to let Clara be forgotten, it mattered. It changed something. It changed us. Ernest looked at the photograph of his grandfather's work, seeing it as an act of resistance and solidarity. My grandfather risked his life to help create that image. He kept their secret for decades. He believed that bearing witness was sacred work, even when it was dangerous, especially when it was dangerous. As darkness fell, lights illuminated the memorial, making the photograph visible from blocks away. People walking along Auburn Avenue would see it. 3 women, friends, 1 murdered, and 2 bearing witness. Their story finally told after 121 years of waiting. Clara Johnson's death had been designed to silence her, to erase her, to make her invisible. But Dorothy Williams and Eunice Parker had ensured that would not happen. They had created a photograph that would outlast violence and oppression, that would survive until the day came when technology and courage combined to reveal its secret. That day had come. Clara was no longer erased. Her story was known. Her courage was recognized. And her legacy, the belief that truth matters, that bearing witness matters, that resistance can take many forms, would endure for generations to come. The photograph that had seemed so peaceful, so simple, so innocent, had finally revealed its dark secret. And in doing so, it had become something more, a testament to friendship, courage, and the unbreakable human determination to preserve truth against all odds.